Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern Bar Cart.
What's shaking, drinks fans? Welcome to episode 310 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Eric Kozlik. Thanks for joining me for another interview episode where I track down the best and brightest minds in the spirits and cocktail world so that I can share their secrets with you. This time around, I'm joined once again by Dr. Kevin Peterson. You may recall him from his previous interviews here on the show featuring his innovative Detroit cocktail bar and fragrance concept, Castalia and Sfumato, and his groundbreaking technical mixology book, Cocktail Theory. I highly recommend those two interviews if you haven't already checked them out, but in this conversation, Kevin and I explore his latest project, which involves sifting through several years of self-reported customer cocktail ratings from his bar. But before we start crunching through these data sets, I think it's only prudent to limber up with a drink. As a little preview of a topic we cover at length later in this conversation, this episode's featured cocktail is the perfect spicy margarita. Taken from Kevin's first book, Cocktail Theory, to prepare this recipe, you'll need 2 ounces of Blanco tequila, 3/4 of an ounce of Curacao. Here, Kevin recommends the Pierre Ferrand expression, 1/2 ounce fresh lime juice, 1 ml jalapeno tincture, 1 ml serrano tincture, and 1/2 ml habanero tincture. Quoting directly from Cocktail Theory here, combine all ingredients in a set of shaking tins and shake with 2 ounces of ice, 4 to 5 ice cubes, for 12 seconds. Strain through a tea strainer into a snifter glass and garnish with a dehydrated lime wheel. Dr. Peterson also goes on to write, flavors are not isolated single-point sensations. They have both spatial locations, like tip of the tongue, roof of the mouth, back of the throat, and time evolutions. I used 3 tinctures to create an evolving time and space sensation of heat, as if a wave were traveling through your mouth from the tip of the tongue down your throat. Make 3 different margaritas using only 1 tincture at a time to feel the difference in timing and location of the 3 distinct pepper tinctures. End quote. By the way, if you'd like to play around with making tinctures like these at home, you can pick up some 151 proof Everclear or some other high proof grain alcohol and macerate some diced peppers in a small mason jar for a few days to a few weeks before straining them and filtering the tincture into eyedropper bottles for dispensing. If you're like me, you'll discover the delightful differences in the flavor profiles of these pepper varieties and immediately start growing super hot peppers at home, occasionally tear gassing your family out of the house when you try to make hot sauce. Or maybe you can just be a normal person and simply enjoy your perfect spicy margarita. With that, let's turn our attention back to the interview. In this data-driven conversation with Dr. Kevin Peterson, some of the topics we discuss include how winding down Castalia and Sfumato after a decade of service provided the impetus for this new project, and why Kevin has set out to address a very different set of questions than in his last book, Cocktail Theory. Why matching a person with their ideal drink is very different and much more difficult, it turns out, from trying to make the optimal old-fashioned or Negroni or Daiquiri. This leads to a conversation about all the variables that go into cocktail preference. Sweetness, acidity, bitterness, booziness, effervescence, egg white, spiciness, and so much more. How does one begin to build such a high-dimensional beverage algorithm in pursuit of aesthetic pleasure? We also discuss some of the algorithmic tests that good bar programs and bartenders can implement in order to zero in on guest preference more quickly. These include good menu writing, the classic bartender's choice speed interview, and the possibility for creating a guest profile with likes and dislikes. Along the way, we explore why spicy drinks might just be a trap, the sea change that I experienced the first time I tasted green chartreuse, the idea of perceptual thresholds in cocktails and in life, and much, much more. As always, I had a blast nerding out with Kevin, and lucky for you, this is a 2-part interview. So warm up your graphing calculators and enjoy this first half of our statistically significant conversation. Dr. Kevin Peterson, welcome back to the podcast.
Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
So you are joining an elite group of multi guests. We've had a couple of conversations, which I've really enjoyed. So we'll link to those. But could you catch our newer listeners up on who you are and give our returning listeners a sense of what you've been up to recently?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of my background. I started my working life in kitchens, spent a little time in food, went back to school, got an engineering degree, did that for quite a while. I was a combustion engineer with General Motors, ran a fancy lab and did tests all day. And then one day said, screw it, I'm going to quit that and open a cocktail bar. And so I opened a bar called Castalia in Detroit that was a perfumery by day, selling fragrances that I made. And then at night turned into a cocktail bar where drinks were paired to those scents. And New Year's Eve was our last night. So I ran Castalia for almost a decade. And now I've been lazy bum for about a month here. And it's a good life. I don't know.
Well, it certainly doesn't seem from this end that you've been lazy, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So, spinning down a bar, there's a lot of moving parts. That was a major effort, and doing it, in the process of spinning them down made me really pay attention to how many memories, how many moments, how many people have passed through the space, and sort of doing justice to everything that happened there. Yeah, it became kind of a weighty proposition. When you're just doing it day to day, it's easy to kind of gloss over those things. But yeah, bars are where a lot of important crossroads in life are decided and decisions get made and celebrations happen. And that was a very emotional few months shutting it down and sort of having all these people come in and share their stories. But yeah, on to new projects for me, including working on a second book. The last couple of years at Castalia, I was collecting data. Grabbed a couple of the data sheets here. Yeah, I realized that my audience is nerdly enough that they actually want to give me survey data on the drinks they're drinking on a Saturday night, which I don't know if that says more about them or more about me, but yeah, I was sitting on a massive stash of data, and I'm crunching through it, looking for correlations between what underlying flavor preferences people have and what drinks they gravitate towards.
Amazing. So it's actual, like you just held up a physical like sheet of paper. Is this?
Yeah.
So you're going through and like literally hand transcribing this and putting it into a digital format so you can crunch?
Yeah, I was definitely tempted to do it on an iPad. That would have saved a lot of effort, but it would have impacted the experience at the bar in a negative way. I really don't like the idea of screens being a part of cocktail time, QR code menus. I don't know. I just like the bar is one of the few places where you can actually escape the digital realm for a few minutes, few hours even, and then to say like, hey, welcome in. Here's a screen. Can you stare at this the whole time you're here? So yeah, total pain in the butt to transcribe those. I did a lot. My staff did a lot. But also, I think something interesting, a lot of information gets conveyed in the weird little drawings people make, and you can sort of see the handwriting degrade from the first drink to the last drink. And yeah, there's something charming about actual pens and paper too. So
yeah,
it worked out.
I like that. I think it's worth kind of explaining the approach that you took to your first cocktail book, Cocktail Theory. I was delighted to be able to send that book to our participants in the Virginia cocktail games, where you and I were just talking about Virginia.
Yeah.
I was able to send that to our 25 semifinalists in the Virginia cocktail games the first year we hosted that competition. And this was right after it came out, and people were absolutely blown away by it. You got recognized by the Tales of the Cocktail Spirit Awards Foundation as a top 10 nominee for Best New Cocktail Book, which real shame you had to go up against Jim Meehan on that one.
Yeah, it turns out that guy's been, yeah, no. If I got to lose to somebody, it might as well be Jim.
Yeah, exactly. So what was the project of the first book, and how is your new project making use of this customer report data a different project?
Yeah, the central idea of the first book is how do you optimize any given drink, whether that's an old fashioned, a gin and tonic, a Negroni. And so I kind of put on my engineering hat and said, well, what are the experiments I would run? I would vary the ratios, I'd vary the temperature, I'd vary the dilution, and then honing in on what is the ideal range for a lot of different classics. And as I was doing that project, it actually struck me when I was opening Castalia, gin and tonics were not a drink that I ever drank. And I realized and I kind of forced myself okay, well, if I'm going to be running this bar and people are going to want all kinds of drinks, I don't have to like them, but I at least need to know what they're supposed to taste like, so I can sort of, do the straw test and make sure it's okay. And so I learned what a gin and tonic is supposed to taste like, but I still didn't like them. Okay, I do now. Flash forward a few years. Turns out you just have to drink a bunch of them, and then you start to enjoy them. But one of the core ideas is even a perfectly made gin and tonic isn't the perfect drink for somebody that doesn't like gin and tonics. So then there's this whole other element of, okay, we're creating these cocktails that are sort of ideal in some abstract sense, but how is it ideal for the drinker? It's you're not putting this up into some measurement system to be analyzed and its perfection assessed. You're giving it to somebody who's going to sip it, and palates vary widely, and some people like it a little more sweet, and some people like it a little more bitter, and some people just don't even like the same drinks at all or the same spirits. And you don't necessarily know what the palate of the person on the other end is. So a couple of questions arise. How do you figure out what that palate is? Can you do it in the span of a first-time guest coming in? Can you do it in 2-3 minutes? As long as it takes to give a menu spiel? Does this information need to be collected ahead of time? Are taste tests involved? And then once you've got the information, how do you turn that into a drink?
Yeah, they say that no battle plan, no matter how perfect, survives contact with the enemy. So as I think back to Cocktail Theory with these really I love how you use the sort of green, yellow, red smiley faces and sort of a scatter plot to plot these ideal dilutions, ideal temperatures. It was a really engaging and stimulating way to not only understand the technique that produces the best versions of whatever cocktail style you're thinking about, but also to be able to compare those cocktail styles, right? Why is the Negroni so flexible? Why is I think it was maybe the Daiquiri was maybe a little bit less flexible. So there's a lot that came out of the data and sort of these ideal ranges that you established in this, but it seems like that is the key learning of a bar, right? Is that it's not about the cocktails, it's about the people that sort of walk in and drink those cocktails. So it makes complete sense that now that you've got all this data and all this experience, having run a bar for so many years, that you're now turning your attention to this seemingly thornier issue. Let's talk about that difference in palate thing, because I'm told that everybody's palate is different. I have my doubts and I have my some senses in which I believe that question, but how does this everybody's palate is different problem inform the way that you are going about crunching these data?
Yeah, so on the one hand, there are archetypes. You've got your bitter boozy enthusiasts, you've got your kind of light, bright, citrusy, and if you just sort of look at the different categories of drink, people, tend to lean towards one or the other. And some people will kind of drink from a number of categories, and some people just stick to one category. So on the one hand, there are some sort of common ground things, but as I started to dig in and took a lot of data and said, how do you feel about egg white drinks? How do you feel about drinks with cream in them? How do you feel about carbonation? How do you feel about nitrogen bubbles? How do you feel about, and you start to break it down. How do you feel about bitter? How do you feel about sour? How do you feel about salty, sweet, umami? Nobody's quite got the same combination of preferences. And then I was also having people rate actual drinks. So one of the offerings at Castalia was a tasting menu. So we would do a seasonal menu, 8 drinks, and we would do a tasting menu where you get a mini version of each. And because the menu is small, we're trying to span, basically the entire sort of range of cocktails. Something's light and bright, something's deep and dark, something's bubbly, something's egg white. And so by the time people have sipped those 8 drinks, they've kind of sipped something from each corner of the cocktail world. And it was insane how little correlation there was with anything. Okay, this menu has 2 boozy, bitter drinks on it. People like one and not the other. This person likes both. This person likes neither. And then you ask them how they feel about bitter, and somebody says they like it, but they don't like the bitter drink. Somebody doesn't like whiskey, but they do like the drink that has whiskey in it. And my initial approach was going to be to say, well, I'm just going to break it down to its components. Break a cocktail down to its components. There's tastes, bitter, sour, salty, sweet. There's aromas. There's textures. There's different ingredients. The base spirit or the liqueurs. And if I can just sort of get people's feelings on each one of these, then I can add them up and just sort of put it together, and there's a drink. And it's crazy. It's like you have to look at everything at the same time. You can't look at them one by one. Let's say like an old fashioned is a barrel aged spirit, some sugar, some bitters. A Sazerac is a barrel aged spirit, some sugar, some bitters, and a tiny little bit of absinthe. Well, somebody can like the barrel aged spirit, the sugar, the bitters, but they don't like the black licorice of the absinthe, and that throws the whole drink off. And you say, well, really, that's only like whatever, a fraction of a milliliter, like way less than 1% of the cocktail, and now the whole thing is wrecked from that, like from somebody's distaste with that one ingredient. So the one thing that we can sort of feel good about is that people do find drinks they like. Like you look at the problem, you're like, oh my gosh, there's no way we could possibly solve this. Like this is totally, the math would be insane. It's coupled differential equations and nonlinear, this and that. And then you're like, but wait, there's like dozens of people like within a couple mile radius of me solving this problem right now. I mean, they're not writing out the equation, but they are like producing the drinks that bring delight to people. So, there's some process. Can we capture that in mathematical terms? Can the data show it? Can we gain more insight? So to me, it's less of like an analytical problem where it's like, we need to like get the ultimate solution and get it mapped. And it's more like there's already a process that works somewhat. How well does that work? Let's measure how well just putting out menus and, freestyling drinks works as it is. And can we add some more insight to that? Can we improve the process? Maybe we can perfect it to the point where like every sip is just mind-blowingly awesome. Or maybe we just get rid of some of the really bad ones and some of the pretty good ones get a little bit better. And every once in a while, we just absolutely hit the nail on the head.
Right. Or
So
maybe you find a way to signpost a little bit more effectively. So there's either a more rapid or a more consistent landing in a higher hedonic zone. Right.
yeah, exactly. And I think one of the really practical things that's coming out of this work is just better menu writing, where I realize not everyone is going to have a giant database and like be crunching all these numbers behind the scenes and tracking all their customers. Because yeah, as we already said, it is freaking tedious to like work through all of these surveys. But maybe somebody reads my book and just says, oh, there are a couple phrases here that I haven't been including on menus that I really should, because they're really critical in the decision making process and the driving the preference to or away from a given drink.
Right, right. Well, and I think another thing that struck me as you were explaining all of the complexity that you're dealing with is, liking is itself a pretty fraught term, because liking is not on a linear scale. At the very least, right, there's certain things about any drink that you could like, and there might be other things in that drink that you dislike. So are the dislikes weak enough to be overridden by the likes? Is it like a weak dislike, strong like, so that it's like, I can ignore that, right? I can ignore, maybe my dislike for absinthe is weak, although that tends not to be the case, as I'm sure you know. And my liking for sugar bitters whiskey overrides that, and I like lemon peel too, so throw that in there. Or is it the opposite? Is the dislike strong and overriding the like? So you have these kind of it's not just one bead on a sliding 10-point or 100-point scale. It is multiple beads on multiple sliding scales that you're trying to balance here. So it looks more like probably sound booth mastering and EQ at a like you said, at a mathematical level that we can't hope to translate to any sort of common sense approach. But you mentioned menu writing. It seems like that is a fruitful place for us to pause. What are some examples early on, as you're sifting through these data, that you think that effective menu writing or communication can play a role towards getting people to that higher level of aesthetic pleasure, or whatever we're trying to get them to?
Yeah, I think aesthetic pleasure is a good phrase for it. I don't normally go to a bar and say, hi, I'm trying to really maximize my aesthetic pleasure tonight, but I think you guys can help me out here. But maybe I should. Some of the most polarizing elements, bitterness is incredibly polarizing. And it's a thing where not only do the people that don't like it really don't like it, the people that do like it really miss it when it's not there. And so just conveying where are we on the bitterness scale, and there's a genetic component to how much you sense that there's an experience component, and getting that right or wrong really makes a big difference. Spicy drinks are like, I don't know, a booby trap. You're never going to get the right spice level for like any more than, I don't know, 25-30% of the crowd. I think this was some data that I analyzed sort of past the point where I was still putting spicy drinks on the menu, but I would be very tempted to give customers a way to dial in their own spice, because so many times as I'm reading through the comments, 4 people sitting at the same table, it's like they got the same drink, like out of the same tin. Way too spicy. The spice is right on. Couldn't taste the spice. Wish there was a little more spice. And it's like, guys, you got literally the same liquid. Like this is not a me problem.
Yeah, that's on you.
It is, but it's like.
Well, isn't that, I feel like the solution for spice is already there in a very, very analog way, which is of course the spiced rim, right? You do the half or 3/4 spiced rim, and then,
sure.
the sal de gusano or whatever it is. And then you can kind of go in as you choose. That's why for me, this is a total tangent, but maybe you have thoughts. To me, I think the Batanga is like one of the most perfect like drink builds out there. in that it's got so many little hooks where you can throw in a little added surface area, whether it's the herb knife stir, I call it the terroir knife, or the salted rim, or the citrus that you put in there. There's just so many places, and just have that little 3/4 salted rim where if somebody totally doesn't want it, they've got that quarter of the rim where it's all theirs and they can be pure. But I don't know. How do you feel about the batanga?
Yeah, I love that idea. I love that drink. I think giving people the tools to sort of tweak their own experience, and just, it's tempting to say, like, I've got the experience, I'm producing this work of art, it should be enjoyed exactly as I intend it. And could be a little hit to the ego to say, like, I don't know, like, as it sits right here in the glass, it's kind of in the middle of where the reasonable range is on several of these spectra, and we're going to give you the tools to sort of push it in a certain way. Some people like ketchup on their steaks, and like chefs just have to deal with that.
That's right.
It's not about like how the chef likes the steak, it's the customer.
Interesting. Well, so I think what you're alluding to, right, is there's this in some of these situations that you're describing, right? There's this optimal range where, let's say, 3 of the 4 people at that table are going to be happy, right? And to me, one of the things that I've been more and more sensitive to, especially after having kids, because a lot of this has to do with like how much sleep I get, or like how much of a given thing I can take, is that there's a threshold where if I'm over that threshold, then I'm completely useless. But if you can just get me to the good side of that threshold, and that threshold's like a very fine line, then it ends up being like everything's fine. I haven't crossed that threshold yet, but the threshold, which is in many ways like the way our sensory perceptions, right? Well, we have these perceptual thresholds for certain types of flavors because our tongue and our olfactory epithelia are sensitive to concentrations of these molecules that we're taking in, right? So I don't know. What do you think of that the notion of thresholds in what you're doing?
You want to give an example of like a particular sensory element?
Let's say with capsaicin, because I think the issue you described with these 4 people at this table perfectly describes it. You can give them the flexibility to be on whatever side of that threshold makes them the happiest. For some people, for the benign masochist who wants to push it over that threshold, maybe their pleasure doesn't start until they're over a certain threshold. Whereas with somebody else with that particular flavor, it seems like their pleasure takes place before they're even approaching that threshold. Like the approach of that threshold even kicks off a set of feelings inside them that makes them suddenly not enjoy the drink so much.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of times that enjoyment curve is not symmetric. It gets better as it gets better. And then, as you say, you cross that threshold, and now all of a sudden it sucks. And yeah, it's easy to, think of like spiciness in those terms, where you're like, okay, getting a little heat, a little more. This is cool. And then you cross that line where you're like, okay, this hurts. I'm not into this anymore. And it's just done. So yeah, thinking about where those ranges are, and I think people have different sensitivities. So one thing that I saw in the verbal comments, people get to rate the drinks, and then they get to leave some verbal feedback, some written feedback. And for the same drink, people will say, "Oh, I love the spruce note in here. Oh, the lychee was amazing. Oh, the pineapple note was incredible." I'm like, well, half of these things aren't even in the drink, but that's the impression you got. And the aroma is weird because there's so many different molecules that lead to an overarching impression. And I'm like, I don't know, maybe you're eating some weird pineapples that do sort of cross over with the 6 ingredients in this drink and sort of the overarching impression they form. So who am I to tell you you're not perceiving pineapple?
Right. I think that that's what distillers must think when they get the spirits judging feedback, like, especially because I'm on the gin panel, these distillers must be like, that botanical's not in there. That botanical's not in there. So yeah, I definitely sympathize with that. The comments must add just so many more layers of complexity. But one thing I wanted to dig into here is, I was reading through an outline that you sent me, and one of the tensions that jumped out as you're trying to sort of like use almost this algorithm like thinking to dial in drinks to people's preferences is the difference between a drink that is most liked by on average by the largest group of people, as opposed to those sort of transcendent moments where people, like, I always think back to the first time I tasted green chartreuse as a transcendent moment. It was like seeing a new color. I didn't realize that this combination of sensations could exist on my palate. And so to
Sure.
me, there was that transcendence, but that is not
Do you think you
like,
enjoyed it in that moment, or do you think it's more of a like, now you've got all this context and all this, do you remember your hedonic rating in that moment?
it's so funny. I don't actually remember the moment, but I remember the feeling.
Okay.
Because it was such a positive experience and such a weird experience, right? So like if I were to fit into one of your archetypes, it would be the archetype of the person who picks the weirdest thing on whatever
Totally.
the menu is. Uh,
Totally.
so that's the archetype that I am. It's funny because eventually I'd like to tie this back to psychology. But I am totally not a thrill seeking person when it comes to like roller coasters, or I would be stunned if I ever go skydiving. I'm never going to say never, but like not a single piece of me has any interest in that. But when it comes to something I can stick in my mouth, like as long as I have a reasonable assurance that it's not going to like hospitalize me, then I'm going for the flavor thrills. So I think
Sweet.
that's what I liked about chartreuse. Like the proof didn't bother me, the funkiness didn't bother me, all these different things pulling in different directions didn't bother me. And so that's why I think as soon as I discovered it, I ended up trying, like, went straight for the last word, like, what cocktails can I make with this? Went straight for that last word. And so that's why I think I confuse like my first last word experience with my first chartreuse experience. I remember going to New Orleans. There was this cocktail bar that served the most chartreuse, like in the state or something like that, just outside of the French Quarter. And we ended up going there, and there was a flaming chartreuse shot called a gas mask. And so early on, I ended up like doing the gas mask, and all these like initial formative chartreuse experiences are mixed up in my mind. So unfortunately, I can't isolate it to one thing. But yeah, anyway, total tangent.
Well, that's awesome. And I think I do want to go back to one comment that you made, which is, it's how it made you feel.
Yeah.
And at one point I was asking people to describe their ideal cocktail. Like less than 5% of people actually described a cocktail. They described the feelings that they would have from drinking that cocktail. Like the easiest solution to me would be, hey, Eric, describe your perfect cocktail. Well, it's got some cognac and it's got a little bit of rye and it's got some Benedictine. And I'm like, okay, great. Put them in a glass, stir it up. Here you go. But that, like, every once in a while, somebody would be like, well, I guess then it maybe has whiskey in it. But, most of the comments would be like, okay, I want it to take me on this flavor journey. I want it to recall these memories of this long lost flavor. I want it to. So they would talk about these feelings or these situations, or, just, sort of being taken on a ride. And they spent almost no time describing what's in it, what glass does it go in, what does it look like, what does it smell like. So, yeah, that was a very fruitless. But it's an important reminder to bartenders that, it's not necessarily the literal liquid you're serving. It is that feeling you are creating in the customer, which is partly due to that liquid. But, your personality and the ambiance and all the things that surround that experience are major factors as well.
Well, it certainly seems to make a compelling case for the bartender's choice cocktail, right? Where the bartender does the asking of the questions, right? And I think you're describing this algorithmic thinking and gathering all this data that might help us to, in principle, like, right, wouldn't the technological version of the solution be like you get the math to a place where we think it's manageable, and then we create some sort of survey where people can create a profile, right? And then the profile gets fed into that. Bartender looks up their profile, right? And so you bypass that step of the bartender's choice process where the bartender is physically interviewing this person, and you instead go with what the algorithm has already collected, right? Is that roughly kind of how you're thinking about this?
Yeah. And I think, a lot of bartenders have an algorithm in their head, whether they call it that or not. Like somehow, there's many bars that don't have menus at all, and everybody working there is asking questions and taking in the input, and maybe there's something behind the scenes where there's kind of a flow chart, or maybe it's left more to the discretion of the bartender. But people do this all the time. And, in some senses, this is just like a more formalized way of doing this. The other thing that I'm sort of pushing for is collecting more data behind the scenes, whether that's a survey that's sent ahead of time, whether that's a profile that's kept in some database. But in the course of service, the last no menu bar that I was at, I saw the bartender go over to this table of 6 and be like, okay, what spirit, what classics, how do you feel about this? And it took the bartender like many, many minutes to go around the table and collect all the information. Then he had to remember it all, get back, set up all the tins. And it's just like, this is very cool, but like from a business perspective, this is, I don't know, detrimental. Because every customer that is sitting there not drinking, that's like a seat that could be making money. That's not.
Right.
And can we take some of this offline and simplify the job of the bartender? That bartender also, if I say, well, I really like, vetiver. Can you make me a vetiver cocktail? It's like, you don't have any already in stock. There's no time to like make a vetiver liqueur after taking those 5 other orders and going back and be like, all right. But if you had that data a week ahead of time, you could order something, you could make a custom syrup. If I'm booking my visit for 2 weeks from today, and you've already got my profile, there's just a different set of options available, a much larger set of options available if there's a little more lead time.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a bar, I don't know if you've spent any time in DC, there's a bar called Copycat, and they have a sister restaurant called Astoria, and they both have these chalkboard cocktail menus where they'll list, sort of these, most of them are just riffs on classics, right? So you have your old fashioned, you'll have your Mai Tai, you'll have your Manhattan, and you'll have your South Side, and there'll all be riffs on those, right? And so it kind of takes you through these, and they're all sort of related, almost in sort of like I don't know if a histogram is the right term, or like one of those node charts where you've kind of got the branching families and different things are connected in different ways. Maybe one cocktail is maybe cocktail A and cocktail B are connected with bitterness, and maybe cocktail A and cocktail C are connected because cocktail C they both have like mint or something in there. So there's some convergence, but there's branching. And at these bars, they're always happy to go off menu for you and do a bartender's choice cocktail, but they've got the seeds planted there. And usually 9 times out of 10, even though you can do the bartender's choice, you're going to be like, ooh, but that looks really good. So while you've been sitting there waiting to be served, you've already sort of decided on what you really want from the set list of offerings. So I think that's kind of an interesting way of kind of splitting that hair. But you mentioned archetypes, and I think really what we're zeroing in on now is this fact that we've got human archetypes that are walking through that door, and then cocktail archetypes that we're sort of trying to match them with. And that all makes me think of the Big Five personality index. Have you ever played around with something like that? You know what I'm talking about? Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a couple things you can do to help the show. One would be to rate and review this program anywhere you enjoy listening to podcasts, especially on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. The more ratings and reviews we have, the easier it will be for other like-minded flavor nerds to enjoy the content that I produce. You can also follow the Modern Bar Cart YouTube channel, where I post video clips from the podcast and beyond. And you can join our growing Discord community, which is where our listeners submit questions for upcoming guests and chat about all kinds of fun spirits and cocktail shenanigans. It's also where I share fun perks and discounts that are too exclusive to blast out on the airwaves. To join our community Discord server or get in touch with me for any other reason, all you need to do is drop me a line by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and boozy adventures are just beginning. So remember, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and sound design by Samantha Reed, data-driven drinks insights courtesy of Dr. Kevin Peterson, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Direct Fire Studios production, copyright 2026.